So if you want to read the Sarah J Maas books and you have no idea where to start, I am here to help you. I want to give a disclaimer that this is just my opinion on which order to read the books. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. I know plenty of people who have started one series versus another series, but I'm going to tell you my preferred method and how I recommend the books to people. Okay, I'm gonna pull them all down for you. That's how committed I am to this video. So let's start with each individual series and what they're about and kind of give you an overview of them before I tell you which way I think you should read them. There is the whole Throne of Glass series. The first book is Throne of Glass. This is about an assassin named Selena Sardothian, and she has been pulled from her prison of the salt mines where she has spent the last year, and she has been pulled into this competition to become the assassin for the king, and if she can beat everybody else in this competition, then she is free to go. Obviously, that is just the synopsis for this first book. There is a whole bunch that happens in this series. As you can see, that was a very tall stack of books, and shenanigans happen in each and every single book. There's a whole cast of characters. This is a world where magic has disappeared, but there are magical elements in the world. There are fae, there are shapeshifters, there are people who can do magic, there are witches, but in the kingdom, magic has been outlawed and it has disappeared. So she's an assassin trying to win her freedom. There is a love triangle in this first book. This whole series is YA, and this was the first series that Sarah J Maas wrote. Her most popular series is probably A Court of Thorns and Roses. This is the one that everybody has read, but if you haven't read it, this is the first book. It is called A Court of Thorns and Roses. In this book, our main character is Feyre, and she is out hunting in the woods to feed her family one day when she shoots a beast with an arrow, and it turns out that beast is actually a fairy. And because she killed a fairy, she is now taken from her home and she must go and spend time in fairy world and live with, his name is Tamlin, in his manor. I will say this first book gives off strong Beauty and the Beast vibes, but that is not true for the whole series. It definitely grows and evolves. It's not yet complete. She is still writing books in this series. Throne of Glass is complete. She is done with that. This one, there are more to come. The third series is the Crescent City series. The first book is House of Earth and Blood. Right now there are 3 books, but there is a potential for there to be more, I think, at this point in time. I don't know if it's been confirmed if she is writing more or if the series is done, but it's kind of open-ended to the point where we all think there's going to be more. This book is also fantasy, just like the other 2. This one is adult. I forgot to mention that this was originally marketed as YA, but as the series has gone on, it has changed to adult. But this is firmly adult fantasy. This one also has fae and shifters and werewolves and angels and all those fantasy characters, but this is kind of set in more modern times, more modern worlds. Our main character, Bryce, has a cell phone. She goes to get her nails done. She goes dancing in the club. So it's kind of more urban fantasy than like high fantasy. Like I mentioned, our main character's name is Bryce. She's kind of known as a party girl until something happens where she gets roped into trying to solve a murder mystery, and stakes are high. Now that we kind of know what these books are about, I'm going to tell you how I think you should read them. Like I said in the beginning, it doesn't really matter. There are Easter eggs in all of them for all of the books and series, and you'll find a lot of theories online about how they might all connect, how there's a greater multiverse, how they potentially are all in the same world. You'll find a lot of theories. I think personally you can read any series on its own and be completely fine. But if you want to tackle the whole MAASVERSE, as we're calling it, who is we, I don't know, then I'm going to tell you how I think you should read them. As I said earlier, this is her most popular series, and this is the nicest step into the world that I think you should take. These first 3 books follow Feyre, and they complete her character arc in these first 3 books. She goes through all of her shenanigans, and it wraps up really nicely for her in this book. The world as a whole obviously does not wrap up completely nicely because we have more books, but my suggestion would be to read these 3. Start with A Court of Thorns and Roses, read book 2, A Court of Mist and Fury, and then read A Court of Wings and Ruin. Then I'm gonna say something that might be a little bit controversial, but I'm gonna tell you to save these 2 for later. Then I'm going to suggest that you start Throne of Glass. That first series is for the romance girly. If you love romance and you want to dip your toe into the fantasy world, into the romantasy world that some people are calling it, I would suggest you start with this. This is nice and easy to read, It's not too complicated when it comes to fantasy world building. I would say this would be your first series to get into, and then you're ready to tackle some more of the fantasy worlds. I would pick this up next. This whole series is way more fantasy than it is romance. There are romantic scenes in these. There are some spicy scenes. There are couples in here that I ship with my whole heart. There is plenty of romance to be had, but I would say it is more on the fantasy side. It is more about the world building. It is more about the political aspects. So I would jump into this whole series next, and I would read the whole series. There is a little bit of discourse about what order to read these books in. I have a video on my channel of how I suggest to read this whole series. One of the things that kind of confuses people is when to read this prequel. I always suggest to read this first. I think it is a prequel. It happens in the beginning. If you want to read chronologically, read it first. However, I do understand that maybe somebody wants to read the first book first, get a feel for the world, feel for the characters, feel for how the writing style is. If you don't read this first, I recommend reading it second. Don't read it in the middle of the series. There's a lot of discourse about when to read it. A lot of people suggest it after book 2. I've seen after book 3. If you're not going to read it first, which I understand, I don't agree with, but I understand. If you're not going to read it first, read it after the first book and then continue on with the series. I say that because everything in this book happens before the events of Throne of Glass, and they make references to things that happen in this in the rest of the books. And I don't want anybody to be spoiled about what happens in this before they get a chance to read it. I feel like it just makes the emotional impact of this book a little bit bigger for everything that happens in it. I can see why it would be recommended to read in the middle of the series, because things that happen in this book, characters and situations kind of pop up in the rest of the series. However, I still think you should read it first, or if not first, at least right after the first book. So you read these two. You read book 2, which is Crown of Midnight. 3 is Heir of Fire. 4 is Queen of Shadows. And then you'll see a lot about tandem reading these two together, Empire of Storms and Tower of Dawn. They take place at the same time. They just follow different characters' perspectives. There are plenty of guides online if you want to follow along and flip back and forth between the two books. If that feels like too much for you, which I understand, I personally like to read it that way. That is my recommended way of reading it. Then I would suggest starting with Tower of Dawn and reading to part 2, then flipping to Empire of Storms, reading to part 2, picking Tower of Dawn back up and reading until the epilogue, read the rest of Empire of Storms, and then read the epilogue. If that still is too much flipping for you, then Empire of Storms first, then Tower of Dawn. That is the order that they were published. That is the order that people read them as they came out, and everybody was fine. I like the tandem read because I think you get more out of it. And then the last book is just Kingdom of Ash. That has gotten you through the first 3 Court of Thorns and Roses books. That has gotten you through the entire Throne of Glass series. Now I'm going to come back to these two, and I'm going to read from Starlight. This is a novella. Takes place after the events of the first 3 Court of Thorns and Roses books, and this book has different perspectives in it. So those first 3 books, all we got was Feyre's POV. This has a whole bunch of characters' POV in it, including Feyre, including her sister, including Cassian, including Morgan. It includes a lot of people. It kind of recaps what happened at the end of that 3rd book. It kind of sets up what's going to happen with the series moving forward now that Feyre's story is mostly complete and we can focus on other characters. So this is a good transition book to bring you up to speed to read Court of Silver Flames. This follows Feyre's sister and is all about her. This book is firmly adult as well. Lots of spicy scenes, lots of fantasy, firmly adult. And then after this is when I would suggest you move on to Crescent City, and you can just read the first book, the second book, and then the 3rd book. This is the most recent book. I think reading it in that order gets you used to Sarah J Maas's writing style. It introduces her Fae world. They're all very similar, although they are all different. This gets you used to kind of her fairy rules so that when you dive into the bigger world of Throne of Glass, you aren't too confused. And once you're used to her writing, her fantasy world building, her creatures, her Fae rules, then you're ready to start in with her adult books. Like I said in the beginning of this video, this is all just my opinion. I'm just a random bookworm living out in the world. You can read these books however you want and still have a very good time doing it. However, if anybody ever asks me my opinion, this is the very long-winded answer that I will give them. I hope you liked this video. If you did, you can see me in my next one, and I will see you guys later. Bye!